Hello, everyone. Welcome to Growing Web3. I'm extremely excited to have with me today Nick Cannon, who's the VP of Growth at Gauntlet. So, Nick, welcome to the show. Gauntlet's an incredible organization. And yeah, I'd love to hear a little bit about your story, how you got into the space, and how you eventually ended up joining Gauntlet.
I guess zooming out as far as it's relevant, I played poker professionally for a little over a decade. And towards the tail end of that, crypto was really starting to get traction. And I actually started using crypto for a proper use case, not just speculation. As a poker player, traveling overseas or the Caribbean or somewhere in like sort of a post 9/11 world a little bit, and with a lot of cash is a good way to spend a lot of time with airport security. And crypto sort of solves that, right? Definitely a secure way to transfer. Needing to transfer, Bitcoin back then, when you run out of chips at 3 a.m. in the Bahamas to someone across the table, so you can get chips and be back in action, was just the perfect use case for a poker player. And obviously, the variance as a professional gambler wasn't a concern in crypto prices and never has been. And then just from there was sort of the hook of, hey, this technology is cool. I like the use case. Moved to the Bay Area in about 2017. Found myself at an early DeFi startup in 2018-19 and got to integrate the likes of like Dharma. Compound was just getting traction. Uniswap had just launched. They were all just toys. Like realistically, we're talking, seven figures maybe in some of these protocols. And really got to play around with a lot of them and think about early use cases. An initial bear cycle, put a light nail in the coffin for anything that doesn't have a lot of traction, something like Uniswap, and knew I wanted to come back. Did a couple of years in fintech before joining Gauntlet, mainly because I, in the interim knew how fast crypto moved and wanted to, stay up to speed. And, the research white paper group that I read with a few friends included a lot of our CEO, Gauntlet CEO, that is, his research in Tarun, who his output is still impressive and I'm on the inside still as well, but helped me keep up to speed with the very evolving space that DeFi was and still is.
That's awesome. I love that crypto solved your problem of having too much money to travel around the world with. It's a very awesome early use case.
Some people do join for the actual use case, this wasn't like even a hardware wallet. This was using, a Coinbase wallet for, standard transfers, tax-paying citizens and all that, but just needed a way to not, want to have a significant amount of cash on hand in foreign countries and in airports and things like that.
Yeah, that's awesome. So Gauntlet, I kind of describe Gauntlet when I talk to other people as it's risk management, it's governance, it's helping protocols essentially manage their assets, their treasuries, everything they're doing. Is that accurate? Or how would you describe Gauntlet for everyone listening?
We definitely get that a lot, right? We write a lot of research, which doesn't, and Tarun, as I mentioned, a lot of that doesn't perfectly map back to the product suite and the platform we're trying to build. The core flagship product is, as you mentioned, risk management, which targets lending protocols, liquidity protocols, CDPs like Maker or over collateralized stablecoins and things like that, where we're tuning and calibrating risk parameters for market risk, which is obviously top of mind for pretty much always, I should say, for all these protocols. How do the collateral assets and the assets that are baked into the protocol and being used by the protocol, how are they affected by existing volatility and slippage and, of course, price into relation to governing the economic risk of the protocol? So let's make this clear, this is separate from the smart contract risk, which I think everyone understands. When they think of hack, they think of, is there a bug in the code? Oracle risk, definitely separate, but there's a lot of overlap with economic risk. And then, of course, governance risk, things like, is there a multi-sig? Is there an attack vector through some of the process of the protocol architecture and the quorum and thresholds that are initially set up? But yeah, the core competency is market risk, and we're a financial modeling platform that sort of runs off-chain simulations just sort of drive on-chain efficiency. Of course,
Mm-hmm.
running tens of thousands of simulations on a blockchain would be extremely expensive. It's extremely expensive just in Google Cloud and AWS. You can only imagine running on-chain what that would look like. But we can, simulate the EVM Ethereum environment or other environments off-chain in a similar fashion with different agents that we know interact on-chain, and then map that back to the risk profile of DAOs and communities and projects.
That's awesome. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot going on under the hood. I describe Gauntlet to people. For me, it's kind of like a black box until the research comes out. You know that they're working in the background. They're helping these billion-dollar crypto DeFi companies really understand how to manage their protocols effectively. But yeah, how that's done is very interesting. And I think one of the most interesting things I find is, a lot of what Gauntlet does is happening in the background, but then a lot of what you do, I guess, is public, where you're going into governance forums and you're presenting research that your team has done and saying, hey, everyone that has tokens in this protocol, here are some recommendations, or here are some things that Gauntlet can help you with to essentially reduce the risk of something going wrong. Is that how your role works? Because that's what I've seen from in the most public sense.
Yeah, I think that's a good summarization. For growth can mean a lot of things. The teams that sort of roll into me are BD and partnerships. So trying to find the best DAOs that we can drive a lot of impact with the existing models and agents on our platform. The technical content writers trying to make technical blog posts, but not necessarily academic research papers. And then also the program management side. So these are the people you'll see in the Compound and Aave and governance forums and on the community calls, trying to quantitatively sort of express the work that does happen off chain. As you said, there's a lot of this that is proprietary, but we're in crypto for a reason, and we like the ethos of open source, and we try to track towards that. So any rationale or reasoning for changing parameters of billions of dollars definitely needs to be backed up, in our opinion, by data and rigor. And we want to make sure that's crystal clear to sort of the wide user base of these protocols. You have the retail public who might just be a user, maybe not even a governance token holder, right? They're just using the protocol and want to know how this affects them. Then some swath of core team developers or active developers on the protocol, and then maybe the whales, potentially VCs, angel investors, large stakeholders that have different, potentially longer term concerns as it relates to the treasury and management of things like that. It's tough to message to all of them in a consistent, clear manner that they would understand. We're happy to go deep. We're happy to try to give a 101 version. That sweet spot's always tough to find, but that's probably why we need to be so active in and around these communities.
Awesome. And so when you maybe have worked with your research team and they say, okay, this protocol, we have something interesting to present to them. We have some interesting research, or we have, maybe a strategy or a product that we want the community to adopt. How do you go about, I guess it's not really selling it in, but how do you go about, opening the conversation? Do you go straight to the governance forum? Do you post, or do you publish the research? How do you kind of get the community to see it, and all these different stakeholders to get interested in it?
Depends on where the DAO or the project is on this spectrum of decentralization. I think, as everyone knows, these projects launch with a hand, similar to a company and an entity, and then they eventually maybe spin out a foundation, and then they turn over governance and the smart contracts to the DAO, and spin up a forum that anyone can sort of access. So it sort of depends. And we help shepherd or steward, or whatever you want to call it, a lot of these earlier projects to that end state that is more akin to what you see from Compound or Uniswap, where the labs team or the initial core team really isn't driving governance decisions. So I guess that's one dimension that depends. In the latter, where it is closer to open governance, you are looking for key stakeholders and doing a lot of research, basically, of what has historically happened in governance. And obviously for like us specifically, we're looking at like market risk parameters. Is there something we can drive? Is the protocol architected in a way that we can drive impact? Does it have the right risk parameters? Is there a way to govern them in a slow and ideally a fast path that can sort of bypass some of the bigger governance changes that sometimes come up? Is there a way, do we think, they have assets that we can get enough data for, that we can make quantitative reasons about? And a lot of protocols, I think, as we all sort of know, list some coins that it's tough to do that for. They don't have enough liquidity for whatever reason. So yeah, we target those protocols and then make a proposal to key stakeholders, aggregate a lot of feedback from the various grants committees. Core team members are still involved even in these protocols that are decentralized. They're definitely, it's in a different fashion, but they obviously have a stake and they want to make sure the protocol grows and continues to sustain itself. It's a bit like pushing rope sometimes, and then eventually you go to the forum and you hope for the best a little bit. But I think that's sort of what makes it exciting for sure.
That's awesome. I guess as well, Gauntlet has built up quite a strong, an extremely strong brand now. So when you're going into these forums, people are probably like, "Oh, okay, these guys are the serious guys coming in." And I've read quite a few of your governance proposals, and they're extremely well structured, and obviously they're backed by a lot of world-class research. But yeah, I'd love to hear about maybe if you have any advice for people who are writing governance proposals or going into governance forums, how they should really approach the community. Should they? Yeah, I mean, one thing I've found is a lot of governance proposals should be more professional, in my opinion. In the way that consultants present research to their clients. I feel like that's how governance proposals should be structured, whereas you often see things that are kind of a bit, all over the place. Do you have any kind of advice on that?
Yes, probably a lot. We talk about smart contracts a lot, right? But the smart contracts aren't the contracts being made with governance or like this market creation that we've sort of seen. And that Gauntlet definitely falls into sort of like B to DAO, going to governance forum, asking for an allocation from the treasury for participation in some layer of the stack that we think they need, or smart contract auditors think they need, and there's definitely ones that will come in the future. There's sub DAOs that are doing grants and doing treasury and different things like that. To your point, the story isn't exactly clear sometimes, right? Like, is the need of the DAO durable, and does like the ask of this governance proposal sort of roll up to the longer term vision that the community has expressed? Now, to be fair to the people making this, sometimes that's not always crystal clear. There's not a Wikipedia page that says like this DAO, these are the top 3 objectives, institutional objectives of this DAO, and we want to drive towards these. There's no RFP process generally for like, hey, would someone like to submit these, and then we'll put you in a bake off and sort of choose the best one at the best price and with the best KPIs or metrics driven, that they're going to drive for the protocol. A little bit of research, talking to all the stakeholders that have submitted governance proposals previously, and then structure them. Like there is, most of the legitimate or blue chip DAOs do have some process from, forum post to off-chain poll to on-chain vote, following that and giving the community significant timelines or significant time to review, right? A lot of these are just net new, and Gauntlet like sort of knows this, right? Like we're talking about risk management for DAOs, and most of these DAOs sort of know the nomenclature of risk management, but what does that actually functionally mean for a protocol that has executable code through governance? And how do we get paid? What's our interaction? What's our liability? Things different like that. So trying to move too quickly is usually what I see a lot of people make the mistake of. Hey, I have a great idea. I think that the DAO needs it. Please pay me, is not the path. Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, that happens a lot with grants as well. Sometimes people go in and they ask for something pretty significant up front or at step 1. And, it often works much better when you phase things, like you start off small and then, 3 months later come back for a slightly larger grant. 6 months later, come back for a slightly larger grant.
And that's what I think most of our maybe helped us get our track record. A lot of it was research based, and then we did a lot of what is very much looks like consultant like R&D, right? We did these one-off market risk assessments that were 30-page PDFs for Compound and Maker or Aave that said like, hey, here are some risk factors. Here's how you should think about architecting your protocol. This is potentially what you should launch with, and these are some considerations for now and the future.
So Nick, so you've written, I imagine, a load of governance proposals, and the ones I've read from Gauntlet have been extremely professional. They're obviously backed by world-class research. It'd be great to hear your advice to people basically creating governance proposals and writing them, and any things you'd recommend people do.
I guess advice for individuals and potentially companies that want to be a service provider for a DAO or a project or protocol is to sort of approach it from a research perspective, trying to understand what the objectives are. Maybe they're not explicit, right? They're not written in anywhere or in documentation. You might have to do some digging through the community, through the forums, through previous chatter as it relates to prior governance proposals, but really trying to find out what the DAO or the community more generally thinks are the durable problems they're trying to solve. Is it revenue, or do they still think they're in growth mode, trying to bootstrap user base and really trying to find like protocol or project market fit a little bit? And after doing that, you probably still have a lot of open questions. You should try to ask the community or very key stakeholders. They might be anonymous. They might be of the core team or prior core team. Those questions might fall on deaf ears until, for better or worse, you make a more serious proposal to engage with the DAO. Generally, it's good to start working for free for DAOs or until you have a track record in doing something. Maybe it's not directly for that DAO, but it's for a similar like project on a different chain that you can point to. But having a body of work for to sort of represent the impact you could drive and the structure of an engagement or the goals or KPIs that you're trying to work towards is extremely helpful in getting consensus across a broad community base.
Awesome. And I guess you really have to try and figure out who the key stakeholders are, who's most active in governance forums. And everything is public, right? So token holders, if the project is sufficiently decentralized, all the token holders are on chain. You can often, find out using tools like I think Nansen and maybe some others who the biggest stakeholders are. So I think that's quite cool because, you can approach people. And I think in general, from my experience, when you approach like a large stakeholder, maybe an investor, an early community member, and you say, hey, I'm thinking of submitting this. Would you mind giving me some feedback? People are pretty receptive because they understand it's for the good of the DAO, the protocol. And that's obviously for the good of the project they're supporting. So I think the feedback loop there is quite nice.
Agreed. There's tons of tools, sort of governance tooling popping up, and it sort of reminds me of, these blockchain clubs or DAO participants generally are active in more than one, right? So if you're targeting an earlier stage project, you can actually understand maybe the objectives of this delegate somewhere else, how they voted somewhere else, or how they had commentary somewhere else. But to your point, also just try to talk to them. That's generally the easiest way to understand their motivations or what they think is important, and probably can highlight some considerations or developments that hopefully are public, but not always the case, right? It's tough to reach consensus, and so there might be other parallel proposals that have some overlap with what you're working on, or grants V2 is coming out, or there's a migration coming up for a V2 to a V3, and how does that play into the considerations that you have for what you're trying to service the DAO with?
Absolutely. And what DAOs or what governance forums would you recommend people visit to kind of see a best in class approach they can obviously visit Gauntlet's governance proposals from the past. Are there any other forums? I mean, I like MakerDAO. I think their governance forums are really, really solid and really interesting to read through. Are there any others you recommend?
Yeah, I think Maker's a good example of probably one end of the spectrum where it's extremely structured, right? You know who's who, who's saying how the conversation will sort of track, when it will go to polling or executive poll and things like that. Most DAOs don't function like that. It's definitely a bit more haphazard. Maybe it's just a function of Maker being around along
Yeah,
and having more, core unit teams and a bit more established there. There's some benefits to that, and obviously some trade-offs into the speed at which they can move. Ave's found some good traction. We're obviously active participants in there, and just to call it out, like we don't always get like the glowing feedback of like community, and I think that's probably something interesting for anyone trying to track governance sort of across DeFi is to understand is like all this stuff is very evergreen. It's out in the open. It's very well is the governance DeFi case studies of how these things evolve from their early state, nascent state to post merge and migrations and things like that, and how more people are starting to participate and take an active role in driving development and safety and risk management and things like that as the core teams start to pull away. Avi's a good example. Compound's a good example. And probably more to come as a lot of these projects I think are in their sort of second wave, especially on L2s and Avalanche and others as they start to decentralize for the core teams. You'll see more examples and iterations on the ones we just mentioned.
awesome. Yeah, that's super interesting. So lots of research for everyone to do there. A couple kind of quick fire questions. So I am a big fan of NFTs. However, I think that if an NFT project doesn't plan to have any governance, then they shouldn't be called a Web3 project. They're just kind of like pictures on a blockchain. And I've tried to follow like the governance of NFT projects, and there isn't much beyond like ApeCoin, Yuga Labs, like Bored Ape Community. They have some governance, or they've started. There's not that much happening. Have you seen any big NFT projects that are doing interesting things in governance?
Nouns, I guess, is trying to do a lot.
Nouns is awesome. Really awesome.
Yeah, I guess we get a lot of inbound for NFT projects trying to sort of, I don't know, cross the chasm, so to speak,
Yeah.
into DeFi of like how can we get more usage? How can we use these as collateral? We're of course very hesitant, given it's pretty tough to quantify liquidity and slippage of apes or something like that, and we've already seen plenty of not exactly exploits, but like faulty risk parameters that caused a lot of trouble in some of these projects.
Yeah.
Maybe the purpose is different though, too, right? Like, and I sort of take your point that like, hey, if it's a governance token, it should probably be governed. The the objectives of these nouns and others isn't definitely not the same of the DeFi lending protocols or DEX, and maybe that's fine. Maybe it should just be more explicit of the goals, and they don't need to be tuning risk parameters, but they want to have a social cause or something like that, or it's just a community that's trying to do cool stuff. Yeah, we'll see how that evolves. Definitely, maybe it's just a little bit early as DeFi was a few years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely quite early. I think, yeah, I'm kind of torn when I look at some NFT projects between like, this is really cool, I love this experiment, to, wow, their treasury is huge. And they're saying they're a community project. The community should probably be governing this giant treasury that they've seemed to accrue. But yeah, let's see how that plays out. But yeah, it's a really interesting point that you mentioned that a lot of NFT projects are starting to like financialize or use DeFi primitives, or start to experiment at least with that. And yeah, I'm sure you have a lot of work to come, as you said, because yeah, there have been a few kind of on-chain lending for NFT projects that, definitely haven't had the best risk management. So yeah, I'm sure there's lots of interesting stuff there.
And it might, I mean, it's definitely less relevant, like it, for something like a treasury that's used for a safety module like Aave, where they need to like cover insolvency should they happen. Nouns doesn't necessarily have to do that, and they can maybe keep in native, the treasury in native ETH and sort of ride the success of ETH and fund cool projects when price goes up, and maybe trim back when price goes down, but they don't need to necessarily, and maybe the community will come to do a different decision, but just think of that in the same fashion. So like obviously they'll have different objectives of the protocol, and maybe it's more tied to the success of sort of the chain in the ecosystem they're on. But I think we can all agree, like if there's over collateralized loans and there's insolvencies and there's an insurance fund, that insurance fund should probably cover those people that were depending on it. And that's definitely more crystal clear in the DeFi space.
Absolutely. Awesome. And we don't have that much time left, so I'm going to hit you with the last question that I ask everyone who comes on the show. So you're currently VP of Growth for Gauntlet, but if you had to join a project and be CMO, VP of Growth, which one would you choose? Are there any out there that you think are doing awesome stuff right now in the space?
I don't want to be CMO, but maybe operating in and around Lido is interesting, which I take like a personal interest in. I think mainly because of just its importance for the space post-merge. They have like a lot of trade-offs and decisions to make against their personal growth, which they have a ton of traction for and share of. But how can they think about being, better Ethereans for decentralization, right? Do you want all the market share, and is that bad, or is there a trade-off against the centralized players of the Kraken and the Coinbases of the world who won't put a cap on the market share they're trying to track towards? So I think there's like some interesting tough decisions they're going to be faced with and are currently faced with. I also think the technical team is extremely stellar, which doesn't hurt in this space, and interested to watch how their governance evolves for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really, really interesting tracking their journey. And yeah, like you said, they can't do growth at all costs, because all costs is, we're not decentralized anymore. But yeah, it's really interesting to think about the dynamic between them and the centralized staking as a service providers. Really interesting. Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on. It's been really great to hear about your work at Gauntlet, and where can people follow you, keep up to date with what you're doing?
Gauntlet Network, or same on Twitter. I'm Inky Maze on Twitter and sort of all those forums previously mentioned. You'll sort of see us lobbying, program managing, and trying to manage risk for these DAOs in what is hopefully becoming a more mature space, but time will tell.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Take care.
Cheers.